This episode is brought to you by the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook, the first beautifully designed, fully customizable paper charting workbook designed with you in mind. With 3 years worth of charting pages, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook has you covered. If you've been looking for a solid alternative to charting apps, you'll love this charting workbook. The Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook is available in both Fahrenheit and Celsius editions, and it's available in spiral-bound, paperback, and ebook versions. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/workbook to order your copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/workbook. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 337. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Journal. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with nearly 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormonal health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I'm outspoken about hormonal birth control and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys. I know, I'm a busy girl, but I managed to fit it all in. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with us today. Today I'm sharing my interview with Ila Mostafa all about menstrual taboos. And I'm really excited to share this episode because it really gets into just some of the conversations around how our culture looks at periods. And what's interesting is that, there is a history in each culture, in each world religion, that of course is controversial, but that really does kind of make mention of periods. And often we see periods mentioned in a negative way. It can be interpreted differently. So there's a lot of certainly perspective shifts and perspectives around what the meaning of the words are if you're looking at it, biblical text or something like that. But there are certainly nods in a variety of religious texts to menstruation being dirty or being unclean or requiring a time of separation. And certainly that can be interpreted in a negative way, and it can lend itself to this idea that menstruation is kind of bad or dirty or unclean, and certainly something that we need to hide or something that we maybe feel ashamed about. And it also lends itself to, there are certain cultural aspects of menstruation taken kind of down from certain variety of religious teachings, in that even the sense that women were the bearers of original sin and painful childbirth was like the punishment for that. So there's certainly this religious kind of overtone that has kind of permeated, because even to this day, one of the topics I talk about quite a bit is period pain. And to my surprise, I don't know that it's much of a surprise anymore, but often I'm surprised by how many of the women that I work with are kind of resolved to experience period pain. They feel that it's just kind of normal, and some women just feel like it's just, our lot in life as women to just have these horrible, painful periods. And I'm not saying that in every case it's coming directly from this, but if there is thousands of years old teachings that this painful childbirth was something related to kind of this concept of original sin, it's not much of a stretch to think that that concept could permeate and at least contribute in part to this idea that it's just our lot in life to have these tough periods. It's just how it is, because that's kind of how our culture looks at it. And often I am the first person for some, not all, who is saying out loud, like, look, it could be, it's common, sure, but it's not normal. We shouldn't have to be in pain, and there's other ways to handle it. And, for many women, that's not something that they've even been told by their healthcare professionals. So anyways, I'm always interested in learning about some of the historical context, and really I'm a thinker, so I'm often thinking about how could some of these teachings affect us, and how could it affect our day-to-day, and also for women around the world in different settings, different economic settings, different cultural settings, how could it affect them as well? So I will leave it at that. Without further ado, let's jump into today's episode with Ila Mostafa. And I'm really excited to be here today with Ila Mostafa. I discovered Ila because I was looking for information about menstrual stigma, and I came upon her research paper entitled "The Real Period Stain: Menstrual Stigma and Its Pressures in South Africa." And I thought it just presented a really interesting and important viewpoint so that we could open the conversation about menstrual stigma and even potentially dive into the ever contentious waters of how religion and religious teachings can interplay with culture and how that can impact menstrual taboos and stigma. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Ila.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, so I am currently in my senior year at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois, and I did this project on menstrual stigma in South Asia because it's just something that I grew very interested in. Initially, the project had a very different direction, but as I discovered more about menstrual stigma and I thought about my personal experiences with it, I realized that that's really what I wanted to study and dig deep into.
Well, I think we were just chatting in the pre-chat. I feel like a really nice opener to this conversation might even be your experience with, just your experience with menstruation, because I won't give away what you were sharing with me, but I feel like that is a really great place to start. Would you mind sharing a bit about your own experience with menstruation and how it differed based on where you were living and the different kind of cultural experience, even within the same culture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was just telling you earlier that menstrual experiences in the US and in Bangladesh, where I'm originally from, are very, very different. So about 3 years ago, I went back to Bangladesh to visit some family, and that's also when I conducted most of the research that I did for this paper. And when I got my period, I had to wrap up my used pad in like the packaging that it came in, and then I had to wrap that in newspaper, and then I had to hide it underneath my shirt, and I'd walk to the balcony really quickly, and I'd quickly put it under a rag that was in this bucket just to hide it again. Whereas in the US, I find that there's receptacles in every bathroom stall, for like in the women's bathrooms, for period products, for used period products, and I find even at home that I can just throw it in the trash can, and that's it. So the extensive process that I went through in Bangladesh really showed me the extent to which menstrual stigma is so kind of battered into the mindset there. And I think that was what really opened my eyes to this idea that menstrual stigma is very different cross-culturally.
Well, and could you, just based on the research that you did and the experiences that you had, do you want to share with us what your definition is, or not but just talk us through, how would you define menstrual stigma, and what kind of impact does it actually have on our lives?
So to define stigma, we go back to the definition that the sociologist Goffman established, saying that it was a stain or a mark that sets people apart from others. So it's this quality of othering that really defines menstrual stigma. And in this case, it's othering people that experience menstrual periods. And it's this taboo, this disgust that's surrounding the idea of menstruation, and oftentimes menstrual blood itself. In a lot of places across the country and in a lot of texts, scholars have associated the idea of menstrual blood with this abomination of the body, something that keeps women from being pure and clean. So yeah.
Well, and what's interesting is that this is all very controversial waters. So, for everyone who's listening, Ila and I are going to do our best to explore these ideas.
Yeah.
And the goal is not to try to vilify any particular group or anything, it's just to try to have a conversation around it. So, a couple observations that I've made is that you can't, if you search the academic literature about menstrual taboos, you'll find countless examples of examples from specific texts, so typically specific religious texts. And what I find to be really interesting is that, so for example, from an academic perspective, they may interpret this text, like just a section of text without the context, to mean a certain thing, and then use that as a way to describe, okay, this is why it's dirty and unclean and etc. But then if you speak to a different person and typically the academics that are doing this are not necessarily parts of that particular religion or culture. So then if you have somebody who's actually part of that religion or culture, they'll look at the same text and say, well, it's not within the context of what it means, and it's not how it actually works culturally. So in your research and your experience, could you talk a little bit about that and how, I mean, obviously, like when it comes to religion and culture, it's not always practiced exactly how it's laid out either.
Yeah, so in this project, I focused on South Asia. So the two big religions that I looked at in my paper were Hinduism and Islam. As a practicing Muslim myself, I looked at Islam first. So in the Quran, menstruation is referred to as hayad. And during menstruation, a woman is considered unclean and she can't pray. And the Quran verse itself, it's called Surah al-Barak. The Quran verse refers to women as a pollution during their period. And later on in the surah, it says that Allah loves those who are pure and clean. So it's almost suggesting that during this time in a woman's life, she is unclean and impure, and in that way, Allah will not accept her. And that's a really problematic way to think, because it denies the idea that menstruation is a very natural process. And it also kind of gives people leeway to mistreat women who are on their period or who may be vulnerable during their period. So it isn't the best way to approach menstruation, I believe. I think religion, there are so many facets within a religion that it's hard to simply say that this is wrong and this is right, because for some people that line is blurred, and for some people they don't know whether to go along with what's in the Quran or go along with something that they believe more socially, which is something that I think I experienced as well. When I was younger, I understood that, yes, I'm on my period, so I can't pray because I'm not clean. But as I got older, and especially as I got into this research, I was like, well, a natural process in my body shouldn't define my faith. And yet it seems that that's what Islam is telling me to do. On the other hand, with Hinduism, the big thing that I noticed in my readings was that women were not allowed, again, to pray. Some women in some parts of India are not allowed to enter certain parts of the house. They're not allowed to cook. Many women are often put into a separate hut or house near their own house when they're menstruating to kind of, I guess, banish the evil spirits that come with menstruation. And so there was one specific case that I looked at. So this was in South India, in Tamil Nadu. Women were actually, there was a girl who was separated from her house and she was put in a hut. And a cyclone hit the village, or I think the town, and she died because she couldn't get out of that hut. And yes, there's natural disaster, there's lack of accessibility, but for the most part, it is the fact that menstrual stigma endangered her life in a way. If she had been in the house with her family, maybe she would have been able to get out, maybe she would have been more safe. It's hard to say. I can't speak for that woman, I can't speak for that woman's family, but menstrual stigma definitely played a big role in her life, it seems.
Well, and so as I already, this is all very kind of dangerous. Well, not dangerous. Let me rephrase. This is all very contentious territory. So, because again, what is written somewhere doesn't necessarily match with a lot of women's experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you touched on how your experience of menstruation personally was different, in one region versus another, and how it was dealt with culturally just based on where you were geographically located.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the woman who's listening who says, I have never felt that way at all. I actually like having some time by myself when I have my cycle. I've never felt like anyone has ever told me that I was dirty or unclean. So, and also like I've heard the women say like this is being taken out of context because there's so many places, for example, in various religious texts that show the love for everybody, regardless. So how do you kind of reconcile some of those different viewpoints from your own, and even how does it filter into your own experience?
I think the big thing that comes to my mind first is what I just say in my day-to-day life is that to each their own, for sure. Everyone has their own individual experiences, and there's no way one person can speak for another person. To the woman who maybe has never felt stigma, or who appreciates the time by herself, or who accepts the teachings of her religion in terms of menstrual stigma, I say that that is that person's prerogative. A lot of people don't necessarily have the privilege to not feel the stigma. A lot of people, especially young women, may not understand the tenets of their religion when it comes to restricting their activities. And also, you have to remember that when we talk about women, we can't just talk about women in the US or even just women in urban areas in Bangladesh. We have to talk about women in rural villages in Bangladesh. We have to talk about uneducated women, illiterate women, women who maybe have abusive families, women who don't necessarily have the same access to all the resources that all other women do. And another thing that I think often goes like it's brushed over in this discussion is gender nonconforming people that still experience periods. And I think that's really what I think solidifies this idea that a period is a natural bodily function, and gender and identity is something that you define for yourself. And when people associate something that you're supposed to identify for yourself with a natural process that they've already deemed dirty and unclean, it creates this tension that's very hard to kind of navigate. But I think the best thing to do in this situation is to, yes, understand that everybody has their own experiences, but largely to take a second to consider someone else's experiences and say that while I may not feel this, someone else may feel this.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because then you're right, everyone does experience this so differently. And what I find to be interesting, so I was brought up Christian, so that's my kind of religious ties. But I wouldn't say that I identify in all of the ways I would kind of just say that that's how I was the kind of how I was brought up and the framework. But what I find to be interesting then from that kind of objective perspective is that when you look at the religious texts from a variety of different, just a variety of different world religions, some of these similarities appear in many of them. And from that perspective, just as from that kind of journalist observer perspective, what I find interesting isn't necessarily like strict to how it's said in the text, because everyone creates their lives and lives their lives in different ways. So even if it says XYZ in the text, it doesn't mean that your relationship with your partner is like strictly based on what it says in this book.
Yeah.
But what I find more, interesting in general is that if we look around today, we can think that these kind of ancient stigmas don't affect us now. But I think differently. I think that history affects us today. And the example that I often use is, like one of the examples that I often use, and my longtime listeners might be sick of me hearing it, but I'm probably not going to stop saying it, is that in my perfect world, we would just have menstrual products free and available in every public bathroom, because we would acknowledge that it's a normal bodily function, and I don't have to bring toilet paper around if I have to, urinate or defecate or whatever when I'm in public. It's there. So even the absence of that and the absence of discussion and the presence of shame and even though you mentioned it's different, your experience was different here in America.
Mhm.
I mean, it's still something that we're not really
Yeah.
broadcasting it.
Yeah, I think menstrual stigma is something that unfortunately is present for all people that have periods all across the world. Especially, I think a lot about young girls, who maybe have just reached menarche or who, were having their period for the first time. It's easy to feel embarrassed and to feel nervous about it. And there are a lot of odd rumors going around about it all the time, But the big thing that I think, even when I was younger, like when I was a teenager, I would still, hide my pad like in my pants or in my shirt, and like rush to the bathroom so that, no one could tell that I was on my period. And when someone did find out, I was so embarrassed and I was so nervous that other people would find out. So menstrual stigma, unfortunately, is very rampant, and women feel it in many different ways. And I think that the way that it manifests itself in culture and in religion varies from place to place. But I still stand by my opinion, that it is a dangerous thing. It is a harmful thing that affects women, and that it's something that people don't really think about. You were talking about the cost of menstrual products, and that's another big thing, especially in South Asia. When I was in Bangladesh, and especially when I was touring some pharmacies in Bangladesh, I found that all the pads were kept on the very, very top shelf of a pharmacy. And when I asked the man, it's always a man at the counter, I asked him, can I see the pads? He actually took one down, dusted it off, and then gave it to me. Because women just don't feel comfortable walking out and buying pads. And, and one of the women that I interviewed, I asked her, do you go buy your pads yourself? And she said, no, absolutely not. My husband goes and gets them for me. And even then, I imagine he just kind of points at it. And when I bought a pack of pads in Bangladesh, there was a man behind the counter, and he took the pads, he put them and he wrapped them in newspaper, and then he put it in a plastic bag, and then he gave it to me so that no one would know that I was getting pads from the store. So the idea that we have to hide something so natural for the sake of others, so that others don't feel embarrassed, so that others don't know about this, is really, I think, frustrating, and it's really dangerous, and gets at that innate inequality that women feel when compared to men, and that exists between men and women. So it's about gender inequality, it's about religious aspects and cultural aspects, but at the very, very bottom, it gets to this inequality that we feel.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's so fascinating on the most basic level, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every human being is on Earth because their mother had a menstrual cycle.
Yes.
And if women didn't menstruate, there would be no next generation. I mean,
yes.
So
mm-hmm.
I think that it's interesting and necessary to ponder those questions. And that's why I find myself looking at because you're kind of looking for answers. You kind of, where did this come from? And so then it's interesting because anyone who's wondered where this comes from eventually is going to stumble across religious texts. And if you didn't know what they said, to see that often menstruation, and again, it's different, it's up for interpretation how that can be used and passed down and acted out within different cultures. But when you look at the actual text in the books, out of context, for example, it does paint a pretty unequal negative perspective to say that women are ritually unclean because of this. How it's experienced is different, how it's interpreted and how, but I think that you raised a really important point to consider because you mentioned that disparity. So it's different for urban, educated, middle to upper class women who have the money to access basic menstrual products and services and also have the agency within their relationships to have these conversations and to really negotiate what they want this to look like, versus women who may not have that same degree of agency in their relationships. And one of the things, so correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that I was reading about, so how problematic this can get. So if you don't have access to money, you don't have the ability to purchase sanitary, hygienic menstrual products. Share with us just what this looks like for some women who don't have this same access in impoverished areas, who then don't even have the ability to purchase products.
In my project, I interviewed both women in an urban area and women in a rural village. So very vast, different socioeconomic statuses. And the big thing I found was that with women in the more urban area, they all used pads or some sort of modern menstrual product, whereas almost all the women in the village that I interviewed them, they used cloth. They were a little bit older, so that does explain it. But for the most part, women used the cloth because it was a cheaper alternative. But unfortunately, the cloth isn't hygienic because it's something that they would wash and reuse. And oftentimes, they'd try to dry it, but they would want to dry it somewhere where men couldn't see it. So they would hide it maybe in a dark place or somewhere that they wouldn't get a lot of light or air, and it would still be damp and they would still use it again. And that's going to cause lots of health problems, including RTIs and things like that. So not having access to menstrual products that are safe and hygienic is really hard for women who will experience health problems. And again, it's all, yes, because of the cost difference. Why? And I asked myself, why are menstrual products so expensive? Why is it so expensive to maintain a lifestyle that is natural? Why is it so hard to take care of something that happens to me naturally? Why are these women, I should say, why are these women forced to adjust to other people when it's their bodies and it's their experiences? And it's almost this idea that every aspect of, even down to this natural system is that, it's being adjusted for the sake of somebody else, almost as if we're living for somebody else, as if we exist for somebody else. And that again goes back not only to the disparity between, urban women and women in villages, but also between men and women, and how women are constantly told to redefine themselves, reform themselves for others.
Mm-hmm. It's such a good point. And when you were talking about that, this is something that I've addressed on the podcast in different ways throughout the years. The concept of reusable products and becoming less dependent on the system, and the concept of young girls in certain places not being able to attend school because of their periods, and that being a barrier for them. And so knowing the worst case scenario, so obviously using reusable pads, not even being able to hang them out so that they can dry properly, so that you can reduce the risk of urinary tract infections and all of those types of things. So when you're sitting pretty in a nation living a middle to upper class urban life, then it's easy to think that this doesn't affect me. But I feel that from this angle, we may think that we're free of those things, but I have made a few observations. One of the observations I've made is that a lot of women think it's totally normal and fine to have painful periods and to have outrageously raging PMS. Yes. And we just accept this as normal because periods suck. And this is like almost like it's literally called a curse. And it was almost like, if you have any, and being a person, like I mentioned with the Christian kind of background, it's like that idea that we were cursed because we were thrown out of the Garden of Eden. Like, I'm not trying to bring up all the religious, but I want to share how that particular teaching within the context of how I grew up, I see that as part of this story. I mean, I can choose to accept it or ignore it, right? So you can guess which one I did. But at the same time, isn't that interesting? Because so many women, whether or not they're resonating with all of the things we've talked about, do identify with that concept that this is a curse, that it's my plight as a woman to have to experience this pain. And if that isn't related to, again, historical stigma, then what is?
Yes, that's absolutely right. When I was interviewing women, I asked them, how do you feel when you're on your period? And they're like, I don't feel good at all. I don't feel like doing anything. I'm in a lot of pain. I just want to lie down. And I say, well, then what do you do? And, a lot of the women said, well, how can I not work? How can I not do what I have to do? It's almost like this isn't a viable excuse because it's something that everyone has to do it. So, and if she can do it, then you can do it. But that's not the case. And the case is often that if I'm struggling, then she is too. Period cramps, PMS, there's a lot of things that come with your menstrual cycle, it's not just cramps and mood swings and things like that. It has to do, oftentimes women can't keep food down, women feel feverish, women have diarrhea. There's lots of symptoms that come with it. And when we kind of glaze it over as a curse or women's business, we are denying equality between genders, but also we are denying women the same pursuit of life that we are giving men. The idea that if a man is sick, well, then take a day off, you're okay. When you're on your period, it is health condition. It is something that's difficult to deal with. And you can take painkillers and you can be on hormonal birth control, but still there are effects of that stuff. And when we ignore that, we ignore the female experience. We ignore what it means to be equal.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting. It feels in many ways that the world was based on men's experience. I mean, just got this,
yes.
right? Because
yeah.
because of that, if we look at the lens through a solely male perspective, then we are other, and we are so. It's almost like they had to explain away the situation by pretending that it didn't exist or something, and really just. I suppose one of the questions that I wanted to get to is, where do we go from here? I mean, my first schedule of business, menstrual products need to be in every bathroom, like enough.
Yes.
Like, I feel like if we got to the point where we could just do that, everyone could, because there are people who have really, like, who, if I say that, they're going to have like a reaction. Oh, no, you couldn't do that. People would just steal them and play with them. If you did that in high schools, da, da, da. But the thing about it is, yeah, that might happen for like a couple of days, but eventually it's just going to be normal. Like, do you see people running to the bathroom and hoarding water because it's available from the tap? No, you don't. Just given the research that you did, the conversations that you had, the experiences that you've had personally. And since then, you mentioned it was about 3 years ago. So you've had a lot of time to think about this and focus on it. And what have you come up with? How can we make this better for everyone who's women and everyone who experiences periods?
I think, that's a great question. Well, I do agree with you. Like you said, menstrual products should be free, because menstruation doesn't take a break. Like, your period isn't going to say, well, you don't have money this month, I guess I won't come. It's very much, it comes every month. And if you can't take care of it, then it's not something that you can hide openly. You can bleed everywhere, you're going to have, side effects, things like that. So by making menstrual products free and accessible, that's going to be one way that we kind of push back against the stigma, saying, you know what, yes, this exists, but this is what we're doing to make the situation better. And I think on top of that, maybe companies, schools, workplaces, understanding that menstruation is a very difficult time. It's not always easy for everybody. Some women feel extreme pain. Some women feel very nauseous. Some women can't get up out of bed. So understanding that menstruation is different and difficult for a lot of people is very important. And finally, I'd say it's important to have men understand that this is not women's business. And I think at the same time, for women to understand that it's not something that we have to hide from people. It's natural. It's a natural process. That's a part of our body. We look at menstrual blood and we're like, oh, that's disgusting. But it's not. It's from your body. It's natural. It's what your body is doing. And I think once men and women understand that and accept that, it'll be a little bit easier to kind of guide through the waters. Especially, I think, men who consider it women's business or who don't think about it. Like, I went to the store once and I had to get pads. I was still really, really young. And so my dad stopped in the middle of the store and he's like, okay, go do your stuff and I'll just be here. And I'm like, okay. I just had to go get pads. So I think that when men become a little more understanding of it and a little bit more accepting of the idea that it's a natural process that affects most, if not all, women, it's never going to be easy. I think there's a long way to go, unfortunately. I think that there are ways that we can start to get where we want to go. And oftentimes it starts with communication.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I mean, shout out there's a lot of men who are already there.
Yes.
because the way I see it is that a lot of men share households with women,
Yes. Yeah.
whoever that is, mother, sister, daughter, wife, partner, et cetera, cousin, friend. So a lot of, I mean, at the end of the day, it's like you can't escape it, right?
Yeah.
You can try, we can all pretend that it doesn't exist, but at the end of the day, it does.
It
And
does, yes.
so it's interesting that I had a conversation with Laura Owen, who introduced me to the concept of reproductive labor, which I thought was really interesting and relevant to our conversation, because essentially women have been left to bear the brunt of the burden of reproductive labor, meaning that even though your average woman today doesn't have 8 kids, right? Your average woman today, who knows, but probably between 2 and 3 children. I'm just making this up, so you can fully correct me if you need to, anyone who's listening. I did look at some stats from like the early 1900s, and the average woman was having like 4 to 5 kids. So it's obviously not that. But with that said, if you are a woman or a person who's menstruating and you're menstruating throughout your life, and then you have, a couple of kids, it means that what is the same thing that we've been talking about. You're having periods, you're having them cyclically. Whether you're taking some methods of birth control or not, you're still bleeding. And it's interesting that the burden, the financial and also in general, complete burden of that is placed solely on us. I mean, so that concept of reproductive labor is really interesting. And then in addition to the actual purchasing of products and managing the bleeding, you have, and I have both alluded to just what comes along with that, the issues. So I would add a layer to that, the viewpoint, because women do experience menstruation in different ways. And there are a lot of women who experience a lot of pain and a lot of challenges, health challenges, and all those types of things. What I think is interesting is that I feel that the stigma around menstruation as being necessarily problematic, as it being natural for it to be this horrible thing, and for it to be normal that it's painful, and for it to be normal that women are having, moderate to severe mood changes and issues like that. It prevents the conversation from going to a point where we can talk about what does it mean to have a normal cycle. For me, my whole, like, a big part of what I do is to share the idea that the menstrual cycle is a vital sign, and we need to have a conversation about what's normal and what's not. And although it's very common for women to have these horrible experiences with their periods, is it normal? If we looked at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and looked at what is normal, and if we said to ourselves, well, pain in any other context isn't normal, so why would it be normal here? Severe mood changes aren't normal in any other context, so why would it be here? And looked at it as a sign of health, and basically your body's way of saying something's out of balance. There's so many proven treatments, there's so much scientific research, there's so many women who've listened to this podcast who over the years have improved their own periods and reduced their own pain and reduced their own PMS symptoms. So I mean, not talking about it all prevents us from even having that conversation about, okay, let's empower ourselves to improve our experience of our period. So I'm sure you'd have like to speak to that as well.
Yeah, I think the culture of silence, that's something which is a phrase that I came upon a lot while I was reading for my paper. This culture of silence that surrounds menstruation is very difficult for women. It's very dangerous for women. I appreciate that in the US, I find that more and more people are coming to talk more about menstruation and about women's health in general. Podcasts like yours, and oftentimes OBGYNs and doctors, they'll, maybe go on TV or on radio shows or whatever, they'll talk about it. And there's always so many books about it as well. So I think that the start of conversation that I've seen in the US is so important. And I think that it still has a long way to go in terms of changing how we look at menstruation and how we accept menstruation. But in Bangladesh, it's something, and especially in a lot of places in South Asia, not just Bangladesh, it's still necessary. Women they feel a little odd talking about it. But when I was interviewing women, especially in the village, I found that this room that I was sitting in, a lot of women came and gathered and was listening to me talk to the women I was interviewing and asking her questions. So it's clear that women are interested in knowing what is this research? What is this topic about? What is controlling us? What is that kind of thing? So I think that, trying to find ways to talk about it is going to be the most important thing, but you have to stop then because of this idea of propriety, which I find very dangerous, to be honest. I think this obsession with propriety that I find so often in South Asia is what keeps the conversation from moving. It keeps men from talking about menstruation. It keeps women from telling others about menstruation. And I think that's the big hole.
I wanted to pop in with a quick message from today's sponsor, Audible. Did you know that you can listen to The Fifth Vital Sign for free when you sign up for a 30-day trial with Audible? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/audible for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/audible. Now let's jump back into today's episode. What do you mean when you say propriety?
So I find it a lot in South Asia when it comes to culture and tradition. The idea is that women must be proper. And proper, they never give you one definition of it in South Asia, but it always means to be quiet and to sit up straight and to talk politely and to only talk about like the 4 subjects that are okay to talk about in public. Women shouldn't do this too much and do that too much. They shouldn't wear this color or that color. They should eat like this and talk like this and sit like this. So these guidelines for a woman's existence in South Asia really, really limit them in the conversations they can have and the openness that is possible when it comes to talking about menstruation.
Well, geez. It's interesting because the way you're describing it feels more overt, kind of the request, it's more overt that you're supposed to behave this way type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like it's more like everyone is kind of like understanding and it'll probably be policed more heavily. And we could think that we don't have something similar here because it's not as overt, but we do. And an example of that is so many women who I've spoken to, countless, hundreds, possibly in the thousands now. Like the longer I do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
How many women have had the experience where they go to their healthcare practitioner, primarily their doctor, and potentially are dismissed, or if they talk about a symptom, okay, no, you didn't have that, or no, it couldn't be that bad. If they have a side effect, no, it doesn't do that. Like it's always this kind of like gaslighting foolishness where your ideas are just not. Or even the super condescending, like, what did you look up? Dr. Google, I'm the doctor here, whatever. And so, but culturally, what is the accepted response to that? It's really to kind of shrink and just not really challenge it. And it's the hardest thing. It's one of the hardest things to actually challenge that authority in those types of contexts. And when you do, because I have, it's not fun or enjoyable. It's usually horrible and terrible. So I guess I'm just saying that even in our culture, it's like not, even though it may not be as overt, it's obviously still there, those same ideas.
Definitely. And, this idea of being dismissed and not believed, it extends into a lot of aspects of a woman's life. And unfortunately, it's very prevalent, especially among women of color, immigrant women who may not have finished, not uneducated women, but like poor women or uneducated women who, maybe don't have a doctorate degree, or maybe who don't finish college or high school because of the life that they've led, the things that they had to do. So that introduces issues of class and of elitism, which I think is definitely underlying, again, going back to this idea of this inequality between men and women, where women are not only considered to be weaker, but also just not as intelligent. But you have to understand, it's my body. And you can stand there and you can get your degree and you can look at all my symptoms, but no one understands my body better than I do because I'm the person living in it. And I think that goes for menstruation as well. I don't think people have a chance to say, well, suck it up, every woman menstruates. No, yes, every woman does menstruate, but every woman menstruates differently. And this is how I am menstruating. And these are the symptoms that I am feeling. And they are valid because I am feeling them. And I don't think people really understand that.
Well, and it's not, even if you intuitively know on some level, I feel like there's a cultural kind of idea that we shouldn't even pay attention to that. It's a theme that really comes up in my work time and time again, because for many women, actually paying attention to their cycles and tracking and starting to understand is one of their entry points into finally trusting their intuition. Because it's right there all along. Okay, I thought I felt this way.
Mhm.
And then I can see like every cycle it's like that. And so all of a sudden I
Yeah.
have to believe it.
Yeah.
As we draw our conversation towards a close, there was a couple of things I wanted to ask you about. So I'm just going to blend these two things together, even though they're not, but this is how my brain works. So one of the things that kind of jarred me into reality regarding the struggles that so many women have with periods was really thinking about what it would be like for homeless women
Yes.
who experience menstruation. Because honestly, to be honest with you, even as deep as I am in all of this menstruation talk, it's not like that was something I really thought of.
Mm-hmm.
And so within the last several years, when I actually, like, it was brought up and I actually thought about it, what would you do? And this is why I'm always on about this, like there should be menstrual products in it, because I keep hoping that some
Yes.
lawyer, like some human rights lawyer, is gonna be listening, or some like legislator, like, if you're listening,
Please.
to
Yes.
show us the way, because I'm just like, okay, if you don't have any resources really, what the heck would you do?
Mm-hmm.
And that is the
Yeah.
most ridiculous. This is supposed to be, like, I live in Canada, like this is supposed to be an industrialized nation,
Mm-hmm.
and da da da. And like, you mean to tell me we have women bleeding and don't even have, so that, and then the tampon tax, like,
Yes.
so yes, take it away.
So I think about homeless women a lot, and I think about safety is a big thing for homeless women, depending on where they are. I just don't think it's safe all the time. There's danger all around us. But yeah, homeless women who don't have access to menstrual products, this is why I think I agree with you. Well, this is why I agree with you in that, yes, there should be free menstrual products, because there are women, yes, who can purchase them, but there are women who can't. And there are women who don't have access to them. And it's not just about getting menstrual products, it's about getting good menstrual products that will actually work. Because there are some pads and tampons that you will bleed through immediately. Not all pads and tampons are effective. Like when I went to my high school, when I was in high school and I needed a pad and I didn't have one, I went to the nurse's office to get one. And it was the worst pad ever. I bled through it and everything, it was a mess. So I think when you don't give women, homeless women, imprisoned women, the same access to good menstrual products, you're kind of just telling them again that, hey, you're not you're not worth this menstrual, it's not worth it to give it to you. You're degrading them and demoting them by denying them something that they need for a natural process. And the thing, like I said earlier about menstruation, is that it does not define, it doesn't go easy on you because you're rich or because you're smart or anything like that. Menstruation affects women everywhere. And the important thing is that we accommodate all women who experience menstruation equally, because that is what they deserve as human beings. And that, I think, is where I get into the tampon tax, where the tampon tax just reiterates that inequality between men and women, saying that, well, if you want to live as a woman, you have to make up for your existence by paying more. And I think that that is so stupid, because I should not have to pay X% more for something I need when a man doesn't have to pay X% more for something he wants.
Yeah. Well, and if men menstruated, right, like the
Yes.
Gloria Steinem, like if men menstruated, not only would they be free, but like
Yeah.
it would be who menstruated first. This, like, it would just
Yeah.
be this big, weird, competitive,
Mhm.
celebrated thing. Ila, this has been such an important conversation. I just really
Yes.
appreciate you having it with me. I could see your passion and like, because it's just so ridiculous. At the end of the
It
day,
is.
it's
Yes.
ridiculous that we even have to have this conversation. It would
Yes.
be as if we were sitting here talking about, like, we need to have toilet paper in bathrooms. You should be able to go to the bathroom and have toilet, like, and
Yes.
actually like legislating and like picketing.
Yes.
And the government being like, no, you're on your own. It's your own problem. You were born filthy and dirty. Just deal with
Mhm.
it. And like having
Yeah.
to walk, like, I feel like it's that level of ridiculousness.
It
So
is. Yes.
I I do hope and envision. I do believe that it'll eventually happen, in terms
Definitely.
of the, like, that practical piece of it. But when it comes to equality and how this could affect us, I think we still have a long way to go, right?
Definitely. Yes.
But as long as we keep having conversations like this one and talking about stigma and acknowledging how it can play a role. This conversation was so, I think, empowering in terms of how it can play a role along different class lines, society lines, religious lines, and how even within the same culture or religion, experiences can be so different, but we can't just assume that everyone's having the same experience as we are. Like, I feel like this was a really great eye-opening type of exploration. So given all of that, what is the one thing that you'd want to leave our listeners with today?
I think I want to say that there's no such thing as a weak woman. I've never in my life met a weak woman. Every woman I know is so incredibly strong, and I think that that's something that all women have in them, this strength, to not only get through something as painful as menstruation, as something as difficult as all the things that life throws at us, but we also at the same time, we're not only dealing with life, we're fighting with it at the same time. We're fighting for the rights that we want. And I think having that mindset of, yes, I'm going to fight for this, I'm going to fight for what I want, and I want this for every woman, that's really what's going to bind us together. That's what's going to unite us and start to remedy the situation. And I just want to leave you with, it seems like our conversation, it seems like I don't want to leave it on a negative note, but in the UK, there's a woman called Amika George, and she started the Free Periods movement, and she has been very successful. So the legislation in the UK has allowed free menstrual products in all schools for girls. So there are changes being made. Women are pushing towards that level that we want to get to. There is hope. So I think that's what I want to say most.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for helping us end on that note. I see it happening too. I see different movements in Canada. I interviewed Jana Gerdaskis. I probably said her name incorrectly. I'll link the podcast episode, and she has started a movement here in the city I live in Toronto, providing menstrual products. The Period Purse is what it's called, providing menstrual products to homeless women and women in low resource settings. Yeah. So this is why it's important to talk about it, so that we can spread these ideas. And there's so many women that are ready to jump in and actually start taking these actions. So thank you so much for being here. This has been such a treat.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, this is wonderful.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/337. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I really enjoyed this conversation and think it's really important to just get in there and talk about some of the societal taboos around menstruation. And I mean, there's so many women that are affected by this, whether we're aware of it or whether we're not. I think particularly because of my training in this area, this was something that I was forced to delve into a little bit deeper. So part of my training did involve going in and learning about different religious views on periods and how it can impact even for the method itself and the effectiveness. So an example is if there's a period of kind of no contact around bleeding that certain religious practices require women to follow, that can have an impact when you're trying to conceive, for example, if that period of time actually goes into the fertile window. And so it's important to kind of know that there are different practices, there are different interpretations, there are different texts that mention menstruation, and there's different cultural practices. And then even within those, everybody is different. Everybody is an individual. And so there's different ways where these types of issues are interpreted and focused on. And even within a certain cultural religion, you can have widely different ways that this is practiced and this is carried out for women. And so hopefully this episode is just kind of raising awareness about some of these different topics, not necessarily saying it's one way or another, but just kind of raising awareness that some women do struggle. Some women do have to hide their bleeding, or just the way that the culture or in their particular family, the way that it's handled, it can be a bit of a challenge. Because if you are a woman of reproductive age who is, relatively healthy, you're going to have a regular period. You're going to have a menstrual cycle. It's a sign of health. And so it's challenging when you have this perfectly normal bodily function that's looked at in potentially negative light in some cases, and something that you have to kind of hide, or if there's shame around it. And so obviously it's good to talk about these issues, to get them out in the open, and with the hopes that one day we can move past this and women can just kind of freely menstruate and not have to feel any kind of ways about it. It would be really nice to get to the point that for all women, it's just considered to be a normal, healthy bodily function. And we just kind of look at it neither here nor there, just as a part of living in a female body. So that's my hope. Of course, someday I'm very optimistic, and I love to see the different changes. I feel like periods have certainly come out even within the last 10 years, much more open in our culture talking about it. However, even with this kind of newfound openness and discussion about menstruation, the average woman still faces at least some degree of challenges, and there's still some degree of taboo with regards to it, in one form or another. With that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning into this episode. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.